On Halloween weekend in 2021, 19-year-old Leilani Beauchamp went to a party in Northern California and never came home. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with a missing persons case. But as detectives retraced Leilani's final hours, they uncovered a violent emotional spiral involving jealousy, obsession, and a relationship that had already been unraveling long before that night. At the center of the investigation was Jessica Quintanilla, a young woman prosecutors believed reached a breaking point after discovering her ex-boyfriend with another woman. But this case is more complicated than a simple love triangle. Because to understand what happened that morning, you have to understand the emotional instability that had been building beneath the surface for a long time. Relationships can become psychologically dangerous when they stop being about love and start becoming tied directly to a person's identity. According to investigators and people close to the case, Jessica Quintanilla's relationship with Air Force Airman Juan Parra Peralta had become emotionally volatile long before the morning she found Leilani in Juan's apartment. There were reportedly arguments, jealousy, and signs that the breakup was not being handled well emotionally by Jessica. For some individuals, rejection does not feel temporary. It feels catastrophic, especially when emotional dependency is involved. Experts often describe emotionally dependent relationships as relationships where a person's sense of worth becomes attached to another person's attention, validation, or presence. When that relationship begins collapsing, it can create intense emotional instability, fear of abandonment, humiliation, obsessive thinking, and emotional desperation. Investigators believe Halloween weekend may have become the emotional trigger point. After attending a party, Leilani went back to Juan's apartment with him. The next morning, Jessica arrived at the apartment. And according to investigators, she found Leilani asleep in bed. Moments like this are sometimes referred to as trigger events, situations where emotional pain suddenly becomes real and unavoidable. Not imagined. Not feared. Confirmed. For emotionally unstable individuals, that moment can create what psychologists sometimes describe as emotional flooding, where rage, humiliation, panic, and rejection all collide at once. Police say Jessica then pulled out a handgun and shot Leilani while she slept. But what makes this case especially disturbing is what happened afterward. After the shooting, investigators say the focus shifted from emotional explosion to concealment. Leilani's body was wrapped and transported over 100 miles away. Jessica's brother, Marco, later became connected to the cover-up after investigators said he helped dispose of evidence. A sudden emotional reaction explains impulsive violence. But efforts to hide the crime suggest another mental shift entirely. Self-preservation. At that point, the focus is no longer emotional pain. It becomes avoiding consequences. Friends and family described Leilani Beauchamp as creative, caring, and deeply connected to the people around her. She was only 19 years old. She had plans for the future. Close friendships. Family members who loved her deeply. According to people who knew her, she was the type of person who stayed in contact consistently, which is why her sudden disappearance immediately alarmed those closest to her. One of the hardest realities in cases like this is how ordinary the victim's final day often feels. Leilani went to a Halloween party. Something millions of young people do every year without thinking twice. There was no indication that by the next morning, her life would be over. And that's part of what makes emotionally driven crimes so frightening. The victim is often caught in someone else's emotional collapse without even realizing danger exists. For Leilani's family, the case became more than a criminal investigation. It became the permanent loss of a daughter, friend, and young woman whose future ended because another person could not emotionally regulate rejection. As investigators pieced together the timeline, inconsistencies in witness statements and phone records eventually led authorities toward the truth. Leilani's remains were later discovered near Salinas, California. Prosecutors argued the motive behind the murder was rooted in jealousy and emotional instability. During trial, the defense argued the shooting happened in the heat of the moment. But prosecutors focused heavily on the actions taken after the murder. Transporting the body, hiding evidence, and involving others in the cover-up. Ultimately, Jessica Quintanilla was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But the aftermath of the crime extended far beyond the courtroom. Leilani's family was left grieving a loss they could never fully recover from. Multiple families were permanently damaged. And this case became another example of how quickly emotionally unstable relationships can escalate into deadly violence when warning signs are ignored or untreated. Dangerous behavior does not always look dangerous in the beginning. Sometimes it looks like jealousy, emotional dependency, controlling behavior, or an inability to let go after a breakup. Behaviors people often dismiss as dramatic can sometimes point towards something much more serious underneath. The murder of Leilani Beauchamp was not the result of a long criminal mastermind plan. Investigators believe it was the result of emotional instability reaching a catastrophic breaking point. A moment where jealousy became rage, where rejection became humiliation, and where emotional dependency turned deadly. But cases like this also raise uncomfortable questions. How often are emotional warning signs ignored because they seem normal at first? At what point does possessiveness become dangerous? And how do emotionally unstable relationships escalate so far before anyone intervenes? Because in the end, this case wasn't just about murder. It was about what can happen when emotional obsession overrides empathy, self-control, and rational thought. And for Leilani Beauchamp, that emotional collapse became fatal. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think crimes driven by jealousy are truly impulsive, or do warning signs usually exist long before the violence becomes inevitable?